Oh, you hear, of course, the narrator repeatedly giving the impression that this is a shooting, perhaps, that in fact could have been prevented. Did you find any empirical evidence or incontrovertible evidence to that effect?
He could not be further from the truth, from the facts, the evidence that we're able to come across. It looks like if the dispatchers or if the police had sent the right team to the location, ALFRED Olango would still be alive. What happened, I think, was tragic in a sense that they sent the wrong people on the location who are inept at doing the job. If they had sent a part team that is quote unquote, in California they have a code called 5150. So when somebody calls in, they make a call called, it's considered as an emergency or somebody dealing with mental distress or psychiatric problems. So if they had sent a team that is trained to handle such people, somebody who can de-escalate the situation, not escalate the situation, I think I would be talking about a different story.
Scott, you are a professional police officer. You have watched the documentary, you have listened and what have you. Is this a case that somewhat could have turned out differently?
It's difficult sometimes to say what could have turned out differently because of the dynamics of the case, usually. Oftentimes we go on these calls, and Montgomery County answers probably well over 6,000 calls for mental health services a year. And we're a county with approximately 1 million people that live in the county and about 500,000 commuters. So we're interacting with persons with mental illness daily. So each case is different. No two cases are alike. It's very difficult to say. Having the training and having a CIT background or a crisis intervention team background really is an additional tool on the officer's belt to help the officer come on scene, make a quick assessment, try to determine the best course of action, and obviously de-escalate things a little bit. Very difficult to do because, as you saw in the video, sometimes you have seconds to make that decision. Very difficult at times.
Interesting. Kanya, you are a lawyer. You also happen to be, of course, working with the American Civil Liberties Union, which of course is always right there in the front line for a lot of victims. In this particular case, do you think that such shooting could probably have been, in fact, prevented?
First, I want to thank you, Shaka, and Paul and the Olango family for really bringing attention to this issue. As I'm sure you know, this country has been engaged in dialogue and discourse over the last few years around fatal police shootings. And the documentary showed, I believe you said in your opening remarks, that there are 1,000 fatal police shootings every year. And that is just too many. One is just too many. In this particular situation, absolutely. I believe that had there been the crisis intervention training, this emphasis on de-escalation with someone who was experiencing a mental health crisis at the moment, that the situation could have turned out differently. And I think that that's the case in a lot of these fatal shootings. We know that 1/3 to 1/2 of those shootings every year involve people in mental distress. And Scott talked about this trunk full of tools that law enforcement have at their disposal. And ideally, in their disposal is this crisis intervention training, this focus on the preservation of life when encountering someone in this situation that is used first, that is the go-to, that is how we're responding to these calls to people in this time, in a time of crisis.
Now, you realize that the judgment, the ruling was that this was a case of self-defense. Was this, in your view, a case of self-defense, or was it a case, in fact, of negligence?
So as Scott was saying, it's very difficult to weigh in on the particulars of a situation. I understand that officers are making split-second decisions, and certainly I understand that it is very difficult for police. They are given a great deal of discretion in how to handle a situation, for there to be accountability, and for anyone other than the police officer to determine what happened under those circumstances and what was the appropriate response. I don't want to comment on whether or not this was in fact self-defense or whether this was negligence on the part of the officer. Again, I know that there's litigation surrounding this, so I do not want to comment on that specifically. But again, I do feel like a good number of these shootings can be avoided if we are focused on preserving life, if we are actually engaging as human beings and understanding that a person in a time of crisis is not going to respond well to yelling, screaming, and having a gun pointed in his or her face.